20:43 p.m. on a Thursday in October, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, watching a man I'd known for exactly 11 weeks dismantle 22 years of my professional life using a PowerPoint slide. His name was my new CFO. He'd flown in from the private equity firm that had acquired us 8 months earlier. Before that, he'd spent his career restructuring mid-sized manufacturers in Ohio and Pennsylvania, places where the product was steel tubing or injection-molded plastic, where a person's value could be measured in units per hour and overtime costs. He was very good at that world. He understood it completely. He did not understand ours. I'm a supply chain director. I've been doing this work since I was 31 years old, starting as a procurement analyst at a medical device distributor in Minneapolis, working my way up through 3 companies over 2 decades until I landed at Vantage Distribution, a $280 million regional distributor serving hospitals, surgical centers, and large outpatient networks across the upper Midwest. I built our vendor compliance program from scratch. I renegotiated our 3 largest supplier contracts twice each. I designed the logistics framework that cut our on-time delivery variance from 11% down to 2.4%. Those numbers aren't things I memorized for performance reviews. They're things I lived through, things I stayed late for, things I got called at 6 a.m. on Saturday mornings about. When the private equity firm bought us, I wasn't worried. I'd been through acquisitions before. I knew the drill. New ownership comes in, does a cost review, finds some inefficiencies, restructures a few things, and eventually figures out which people actually run the operation. I figured I'd be fine. I had the relationships, the institutional knowledge, the results. I was wrong about what that mattered to him. The meeting was a quarterly leadership review. 12 people in the room: operations, finance, logistics, HR. The new CFO ran it himself. He'd been doing these reviews with each department, and I'd heard from my counterpart in finance that his approach was blunt. That was the word she used. Blunt. He was more than blunt. 40 minutes into the presentation, he pulled up a slide titled Compensation Benchmarking, Operations and Supply Chain. My name was on it. My salary was on it. $297,000 base plus a $48,000 performance bonus, displayed in a table next to industry median figures he'd pulled from a consulting firm's salary survey. The column next to my number said 62% above market median for regional distribution supply chain director. I want you to understand what that moment feels like, not the anger. The anger comes later. In the first few seconds, it's just disorientation. You look at your name on a screen, and your brain does this strange thing where it can't quite connect the information to the reality of you sitting in a room full of colleagues who are now all very carefully not looking at you. Our HR director was staring at her notepad. The operations VP was looking at the window. The room had that specific kind of silence that happens when everyone knows something is wrong, but nobody wants to be the first person to acknowledge it. He said, "This represents the most significant compensation misalignment in the division. We need to move toward market rate structures across the board, and this is the most urgent correction." I asked him to clarify what he meant by market rate. He pulled up the next slide. It showed a revised compensation structure. My base salary reduced to $183,000. No performance bonus. A 6-month transition timeline. That's a 38% cut. I did the math instantly because when someone shows you a number like that, your brain does the math before you've even decided to think about it. I said, "Can you walk me through which benchmarking source you used for that figure?" He named a consulting firm. I knew their methodology. They aggregate self-reported salary data from HR systems weighted toward national averages. They're fine for general hiring ranges. They're not calibrated for the actual market in the upper Midwest for someone managing what I managed. I said, "Do you know which vendors those benchmark numbers represent? Because the median regional supply chain director in that survey is managing commodity procurement for 3 to 5 suppliers. I manage 14 direct vendor relationships, including our 3 largest accounts, Midland Health Systems, Northgate Surgical, and the Trident Group. Those 3 alone represent 58% of our annual revenue." He looked at me the way people look at someone who said something technically accurate but fundamentally inconvenient. He said, "That's a historical arrangement that we're reviewing as part of the restructuring." I said, "What does that mean for the accounts specifically?" He said the vendor relationships would be transitioned to a restructured procurement team, managed more efficiently, standardized processes, and I understood then that he had no idea. He genuinely did not know that Midland Health Systems had a clause in their contract that gave them the right to renegotiate terms if their primary relationship manager left the company. He didn't know that I had been Midland's account contact for 9 years, that I'd flown to their facilities in 3 states, that their VP of supply chain called me directly, not our company's main line, not an account management queue, me personally, whenever there was a problem. He didn't know any of that because he'd never asked and nobody had told him and he hadn't thought to look. I asked him one more question. I said, "Have you spoken with any of our top-tier vendors about this transition plan?" He said that vendor communication was a downstream step in the process. I said, "I think you should do that before you finalize this." He said, "We appreciate your input, but the compensation decision has already been reviewed and approved at the board level." I looked around the room. I looked at my HR director, who was still looking at her notepad. I looked at the operations VP, who had found something very interesting to examine on the table in front of him. Nobody said anything. Nobody pushed back. Nobody said, "Wait, maybe we should hear more about those vendor relationships." I picked up my notebook and my coffee and I stood up. He said, "We're still in the meeting." I said, "I know," and I walked out. I didn't go back to my desk. I took the elevator to the lobby, walked to my car in the parking garage, and sat there for about 15 minutes with the engine off. I wasn't sure what I'd just done, or maybe I was sure and I just needed a few minutes to catch up to it. I called my wife. She's an ER charge nurse, so she was in the middle of a shift, but she picked up anyway because she always picks up when I call in the middle of a workday, which I almost never do. I told her what happened. There was a pause, and she said, "Are you okay?" I said I thought so. She said, "Then you did the right thing." That helped more than I expected. I called my attorney next. He'd done some employment contract work for me years earlier, and I trusted him. He told me to document everything about the meeting, including who was present and what was said, before the memory faded. He said to write it down that same day. I did. 4 pages, typed out in my car in the parking garage on my phone. The next morning I went in, cleared my personal items from my desk, sent a formal resignation letter by email, and handed my badge to security. My manager, the operations VP who'd been in the room, called me as I was walking to my car. He sounded genuinely uncomfortable. He said, "I want you to know I wasn't aware the salary data was going to be presented that way." I believed him. I also didn't think it changed anything. I said, "I appreciate you calling. I hope the team lands okay." He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry." That was the last time we spoke. What I haven't told you yet is that 3 weeks before that meeting, I'd had a conversation with my contact at Midland Health Systems, their VP of supply chain, a man who'd been in the industry longer than I had and who I'd worked alongside since the early days of their expansion into Wisconsin. We'd been talking on and off for about 2 months about a position they were creating, Director of Vendor Partnerships, that they wanted to fill internally if possible, externally if not. He'd mentioned my name to their executive team. I hadn't accepted. I hadn't even fully engaged with it. I had a good thing at Vantage, I thought, and I wasn't looking to leave. I'd told him I'd keep the door open, but I wasn't actively pursuing it. I called him from my car on the way home the day I resigned. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had happened. He didn't say, "I told you so." He's not that kind of person. But he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How quickly can you start?" The offer came through formally within 4 days. Better title, better total compensation than even what Vantage had been paying me, and, critically, I'd be working with vendors I already knew, including Vantage. I started 6 weeks after I walked out of that conference room. I want to be careful here about how I tell what comes next, because I didn't cause what happened to Vantage. I need to be clear about that. I didn't go out of my way to pull relationships or tell vendors to leave. I didn't make calls trying to influence anyone's contracts. What happened was the result of decisions the new CFO made, combined with the reality of how vendor relationships actually work in regional healthcare distribution. Something he'd apparently never tried to understand. Midland Health Systems invoked their renegotiation clause within 3 weeks of my departure. They didn't leave immediately. They were too operationally embedded for that. But they used the clause to open their contract back up, and they extracted significantly better terms. That alone cost Vantage somewhere in the range of $4 to $5 million annually in margin. Northgate Surgical didn't renegotiate. They just started a quiet procurement review process and, 8 weeks after I left, shifted 60% of their order volume to a competing distributor. Their CEO sent a note, I heard about it secondhand, saying the relationship continuity had changed, and they were diversifying their supply chain. The Trident Group was more direct. Their purchasing manager, someone I'd worked with for 6 years, someone I'd helped problem solve through a supply disruption that would have shut down 2 of their facilities, called Vantage's new procurement contact, asked for a status meeting, sat through it, and then sent a termination of preferred vendor notice 2 weeks later. Trident was 18% of Vantage's annual revenue by itself. I know all of this because some of it became industry news, and some of it I learned through professional contacts over the months that followed. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't paying attention. I was. By the end of the first quarter after my departure, Vantage revenue was down 34%. They announced a headcount reduction in February, 47 positions eliminated, mostly on the operations and logistics side. People I'd worked with for years, people who had nothing to do with the decisions made in that conference room. That part I didn't feel good about. I still don't. The CFO made a bad call based on incomplete information and arrogance about what he understood, and the people who paid the most for it weren't him. They were warehouse supervisors and logistics coordinators who were just doing their jobs. That's the part of these situations that nobody wants to talk about when they tell the story, because it complicates the clean narrative. But it's true, and I'm not going to leave it out. The CFO left the company in March. I heard he went back to the PE firm to lead restructuring work somewhere else. The board brought in an interim operations head who reached out to me twice to ask if I'd consult on vendor recovery. I declined both times. Not out of bitterness. I just had a new job, a new direction, and I didn't think me going back in was the right answer for anyone. Here's the thing about being called overpaid that I've thought about a lot in the years since that meeting. The benchmarking wasn't entirely wrong on the numbers. If you look at raw salary survey data for a supply chain director in regional distribution, $297,000 is above market median. That's true. The mistake, the fundamental, company-destroying mistake, wasn't the data. It was the assumption that the benchmark captured everything relevant about the role. It didn't capture the 9-year Midland relationship. It didn't capture the Trident disruption I'd solved in 2019 that, had it gone the other way, would have cost the company its largest account 3 years earlier. It didn't capture the contract terms I'd negotiated with Northgate that made them stickier than they would have been with any other vendor management approach. When you reduce a person to a line item in a compensation table, you're not making a financial decision. You're making an assumption that the value they provide is interchangeable, replaceable, transferable to a cheaper alternative. Sometimes that assumption is right. In mature, standardized functions with documented processes and strong institutional systems, you can often replace expensive people with less expensive people and the output doesn't change much. But in relationship-dependent roles, in any role where the actual value lives in trust, in history, in the specific knowledge that person has, and the specific confidence their counterparts have in them, that assumption can be catastrophically wrong. He built his career in factories where the assumption was almost always right. He walked into a distribution company built on relationships and treated it like a factory. The math was impeccable. The judgment was terrible. My total compensation at Vantage represented less than 0.2% of the annual revenue I directly manage. If I were running a portfolio of stocks and one of them was returning 500 times what I paid in management fees, the idea that I would restructure it because the fee seemed high on paper, without looking at what the fee was actually buying, that's not financial discipline. That's just not thinking clearly. I'm not angry about it anymore. I'm settled at Midland, doing work I like, with people who asked me to come there because they understood what I bring. My wife and I took a long weekend in Door County in September, first real vacation in 3 years. I brought a book I'd been meaning to read for 2 years, and I actually read it. There's an award on my desk from the Midwest Healthcare Supply Chain Association. Vendor Partnership Excellence. First year I was eligible at Midland. I got it 8 months after I started. I'm not telling you this to gloat. I'm telling you because I spent a lot of years building something that a man with a spreadsheet decided to value at $183,000, and I needed to find out whether he was right or whether I was. The market gave me a pretty clear answer. The last thing I'll say is this. If you're in a role right now where you know, genuinely know, that your value exceeds what the salary surveys say, Don't let someone with a benchmarking tool and no curiosity convince you otherwise. The data they're using doesn't know your clients' names. It doesn't know what happened on the Thursday when everything almost fell apart and you were the one who held it together. It doesn't know what you've built or who trusts you because of it. You know. Make sure you act like it. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened in that conference room, not the version where I'm the hero and he's the villain, but the real version, where a man made a decision based on incomplete information and genuine confidence that he understood something he didn't. That version is more uncomfortable to sit with. It's also more useful. What I keep coming back to is this. The CFO wasn't stupid. He was smart in the way that a lot of people are smart, good with structure, good with frameworks, good at reading the information in front of him. What he lacked wasn't intelligence. It was curiosity. He never asked what wasn't in the spreadsheet. He never walked the floor, never called a vendor, never sat in on one of my account meetings to understand what those relationships actually look like up close. He flew in, opened a benchmarking report, and made a call. That's not a thinking failure. That's a character failure. The specific failure of a person who is confused knowing the price of something with understanding its value. And I think about my own role in it too. 22 years of building something, and I never made sure the people above me fully understood what I was actually doing. That's on me. I assumed my results would speak for themselves. They did, just not loudly enough and not to the right audience before it was too late. There's a lesson in that I'm still processing. The work of making your value visible is not separate from the work itself. It's part of it. When I walked out of that room, I didn't feel powerful. I felt clear. That's different. Clarity isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's just knowing what you will and won't accept, and deciding that the knowing matters more than the discomfort of acting on it. I'd spent years being reasonable, being patient, being the person who stayed late and solved the unsolvable and never made noise about it. And one afternoon, a man I'd known for 11 weeks showed my salary to 12 people and called it a problem to be corrected. The clarity came fast after that. What happened to Vantage wasn't justice in any cosmic sense. It was just consequence, the natural, predictable, entirely avoidable result of a decision made without full information. The CFO cut a cost without understanding what that cost was buying. The vendors didn't leave out of loyalty to me. They left because the thing that made the relationship work wasn't there anymore. That's not revenge. That's just how relationship-dependent systems actually function when you remove a load-bearing piece without knowing it was load-bearing. The 47 people who lost their jobs, I think about them. They weren't in the room. They didn't make the call. They just showed up to work and one day found out their positions had been eliminated because a revenue crisis nobody predicted had suddenly materialized. That part doesn't feel good to recount. It shouldn't. If there's any real lesson I want someone to take from this, it's not walk out and watch them burn. It's the decisions leaders make in those rooms have consequences that reach far beyond the person sitting across the table. Get it right. Ask the questions you haven't thought to ask yet. The benchmark report doesn't know what it doesn't know. I'm at a good place now. The award is on my desk. My wife and I actually took a vacation. I read the book. None of that erases what happened, but all of it confirms that walking out of that room was the right call. Not because it punished anyone, but because it respected what I'd spent 22 years building. Some things are worth protecting, even when protecting them is costly. Especially then.